This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the Golden Age, play the games they like most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when you could actually walk into a shop and buy a new machine rather than battle robots in an Argos queue at 3 AM. A tweet from quality viewer Jim Carris got us thinking. He thought it'd be nice to see more machines at the height of their power, and given the last 3 episodes have been 2 launches and the PC looking like a bloody idiot, the man has a point. Investigating around his suggested issues for one with games we'd not played before, I happened upon Crash, the ZX Spectrum magazine. Issue 58 came along in November 1988, just before everyone started looking at the 16-bit machines like they were in some sort of popular meme, but exactly halfway through the viable life of a Spectrum print title in the UK. And we mean viable. Crash at this point was selling very nearly 100,000 copies a month, and the next month's Christmas special of the magazine is well over 200 pages. Even this regular issue is pretty chunky, despite a surprisingly small 13 games getting their initial reviews. Our Gaming Heaven is a licensed sports title whose predecessors gave it a towering reputation. The Hell is a straight-to-budget shooter about which even Crash's reviewers couldn't agree. We will of course play referee shortly after we deal with what happened when Sinclair tried to make a PC, and with a game where the very concept of licensing is turned on its head and spun around a little. Spinning around, of course, is a key component of doing at least one decathlon event. And funny you should mention that. Released for the 1984 Olympics, Daley Thompson's Decathlon is most people's first encounter with the genre that was charitably known by the teenage boy-level magazines of the time as the joystick waggler. And by that I mean the kind of athletics video game where the primary means of control is alternating a joystick direction or pair of buttons rapidly. Usually to make the guy run very quickly or perform some other athletics-related task. Huge numbers of games have stolen the basics of the control scheme by this point, and except for a few motion control systems, this is basically pretty much how it's done. Which to a degree means these original games are as good an option as any. Last summer, when the Olympics didn't happen, I joined Weekend Lollygagger and several fine internet Z-listers in a full head-to-head decathlon, commentated by legend in his own lunchtime and chum of the channel, Rose Tinted Spectrum.
Solid fingering from Nicky and Bunty, of course, but it's not good enough. Lollygagger takes it.
Which begs the question as to exactly what a second Olympic game could do. Olympic Challenge is a straight sequel to Decathlon, so out go all the new events from the first sequel super tests such as the rowing, and in come the same 10 you played 4 years earlier. And this game was being sold for £3 more than Decathlon had retailed for. If the information I managed to glean is accurate, Ocean were wise to this. I don't think Decathlon was released on budget until 1989, so unless you could scratch up a copy of the 3-year-old compilation They Sold a Million, there was not a comparison you could make most likely. 1985's Super Test also didn't appear on budget until the release of this game. I'm immediately cynical, but let's take this one on face value. What have we changed in 4 years to make it worth a purchase? And the fair way to do that would seem to be trying some of the events against each other on each game. Or we will in a minute, because Daley Thompson 3 has some busy work for you to do first in the form of 3 different gym workouts: dumbbells, sit-ups and squats. I say 3 different workouts, but all they actually involve is waggling the stick for a whole minute in order to build up energy, which fills the Lucozade bottle. This energy affects your proficiency at the later events. Events you'll have to attempt later because 3 solid minutes of joystick waggling is all this man can stand. Quiet at the back. It actually is Lucozade, by the way, because quite apart from being a third more expensive than its sister titles, this game is also sponsored by the Ready Orange sugar water sold at the time by a toothpaste manufacturer. I am cynical today. You can't avoid this section either, and it's considerably more sustained top speed waggling than any other event in this game should be. Should be. Pick your Adidas trainers. No, seriously, with the information provided here, you apparently need to choose which are the appropriate trainers for this event. There is absolutely no gameplay value to this at all, because if you get it wrong, as I of course do, it tells you which was the right choice. Still, let's try it with the wrong one. It's only a 100-meter run. I could do that in 20 seconds in my socks. What a sports day that was. If only I'd remembered to bring a pair of fine Adidas trainers instead. And let's not even get into a discussion of why it's Adidas and not Adidas, because then someone's going to come in here and pronounce the other one as Puma, and we're going to have a problem. You'll notice, by the way, we are still running. Apparently, if you use a pair of fine Adidas trainers, but not the correct pair of fine Adidas trainers, it's going to take more than a minute to do something that takes about 20 seconds naked, especially with the stewards chasing you. Is it me, or is that not a great advert for fine Adidas trainers if they're considerably worse than not wearing fine Adidas trainers? Thankfully, we're not using original hardware here, and I've saved, so let's pick the correct pair of fine Adidas trainers for this race. A fabulous 19.66, presumably thanks to my 51% rating on the fitness apps. This game is viciously difficult. If these are my results on a good modern keyboard, imagine trying to make this bastard work on a crappy joystick or the 48's rubber non-keys. Was Decathlon this bad and I just don't remember? To the older games, Matron! Nope, that's a pretty good time. And it continues. I choose the wrong trainers for the long jump and the run-up takes 90 seconds, by which time I've long stopped paying attention and foul the jump. With the right trainers, it's still a good 15 seconds. The older game is uglier, sure, but at least it's a game, not a cynical advert for Lucozade and fine Adidas trainers. Back then, you might have had to buy this because the others were off sale, and don't we all know why that was? But in 2021, it's Decathlon, but with a load of utter bollocks taped on the side and the difficulty wound right up to screw you. I am at a loss where Crash's scores come from because they spot a lot of these issues, printing the list of correct trainers in the magazine, complaining about the length of the events, and pointing out that all the useful indications like the progress bar have disappeared since Decathlon. All three reviewers point out how absurdly tough it is. The praise comes from the graphics, which is fair enough, but that's the entire collection of positive points in the review, and they don't point out there's nothing here you couldn't get from a 4-year-old version of the same game. In any case, we're not Crash. Do get yourself Decathlon. It's simple, but an excellent example of how to do this kind of game. Never play this. Ever. Ever. What did I just say? Oh, screw it. I'm putting on my fine Adidas trainers and walking to the shop for some tasty, refreshing Lucozade. We're 2 years into Amstrad owning Sinclair at this point. We've already had the Plus 2, a more grown-up Specky with the built-in tape deck. We've had the Plus 3 disc-based system, somewhat ruined by Amstrad's insistence on using 3-inch discs that were smaller, slower, and more expensive than the 3.5s used by all the 16-bit machines. Ultimately though, these were all patches to the simple fact that the Spectrum was starting to reach its peak. The 16 bits were out and starting to make an impact, and they were clearly going to gradually take over. Sinclair had already failed to join that party by launching the Sinclair QL as far back as 1984. It should have had a chance. It was a year ahead of the Amiga and was much cheaper. It cost a mere £400 compared to the Amiga 1000 and Amiga 500 that launched in 1985 and 87 respectively at roughly as many pounds as their model number. It turns out though that if people wanted cheap, they were perfectly able to make do with £100 Spectrums and C64s. If they wanted power, then the QL's cut down variant of the Motorola 68000 and 128k of RAM were not going to cut it. Also, instead of floppy disks, Sinclair put in their cheaper tape-based microdrive system that managed to be slower, smaller capacity, and more expensive than a floppy disk, while also being catastrophically unreliable. So where to go for Sinclair that isn't going to cannibalise sales of the Amstrad computers? The surprising answer was the Sinclair PC200, an IBM compatible. At the time, IBM compatibles were neither cheap nor plentiful. There were not many in homes, there were not really any consumer magazines. With 3 years before PC Format and 5 before PC Gamer launched at this point. So how to bring Sinclair's unique selling points to the market? Well, first you make it cheap. If you plugged it into a TV, you could have the Spectrum IBM compatible for £350. A complete colour system was still under £600. So far, so good. But the fact you've never used a Sinclair PC probably tells you a butt larger than your mum's is on the horizon, and you would not be wrong. The machine was launched 2 years after the Amiga 500, by which time that machine was barely more expensive than the Sinclair. Here are some things the A500 was doing in 1989. The Sinclair PC uses the CGA graphics standard. If you're not a PC person and thus didn't immediately wince, let me show you the full colour range supported by CGA at a normal screen resolution. Yeah, CGA was 7 years old at this point, and its replacement, EGA, was rapidly being replaced by its own replacement, VGA, which is what it took for the PC to start out evolving the Amiga. The CPU was Intel's 086, which was a full decade old, and while it nominally ran at the same 8MHz the Amiga did, it was not close, and the lack of supporting hardware meant the only noises you would get out of the machine was standard PC bleeper, illustrated thusly. All that was bad enough, but wait, there's more. There was an expansion hatch at the top that you could open and slide in 2 standard PC expansion cards, potentially improving a lot of the machine's shortcomings. If you did that though, then most of them were tall enough that the hatch wouldn't close, leaving a gaping hole in the top of the machine that is just begging for so many accidents. It could take a joystick, but it'd have to be an expensive analog one, and for reasons best known to Sinclair, it also had no hard drive at all, nuking the PC's biggest advantage over the Amiga and ST immediately. At least they'd finally learned something, and it had a 3.5-inch disk drive, albeit one that only supported standard density, giving it a lower capacity than the Amiga's disks. You know how this ends. Dismal failure does not even begin to cover it, and it, along with its even worse equipped Amstrad badge twin, disappeared nearly immediately. The most damning thing is Crash actually review it in this very issue, and essentially conclude by telling you to buy an Atari ST. Advice well taken by almost everyone. Okay, I've got 3 things to mention here before we get to the actual point of this section, and I can't work out which order works best, so let's leave this one to chance. Okay, so the Pepsi Challenge. A long-running marketing scheme from Pepsi involving doing a blind taste test of Pepsi and a popular red competitor. Pepsi, predictably, normally come out ahead in these challenges, leaving PepsiCo to frequently proclaim that shorn of marketing, everyone would buy Pepsi rather than the next leading brand. The irony of spending several £billion to tell us this is apparently lost on them. In reality, while the figures are accurate, it's mostly accounted for by Pepsi being sweeter, and the fact that people generally prefer a sweeter taste from a single sip, but not always from a full can. In any case, the challenge has been a thing in some form since the 1970s, but was probably at the height of its popularity in the late 80s, much like the ZX Spectrum come to that. There are 3 widely known Pepsi games. This is probably the best known, 1999's PlayStation 1 title Pepsi Man. No wait, sorry, that's not how that's pronounced. It's strange that this is so well known, because it's a Japanese-only release, despite being entirely in English. The character Pepsi Man was a bit of a Japanese thing in the main, even making an appearance in their version of Saturn game Fighting Vipers. Still, Pepsi Man isn't actually that bad a game, giving off Crash Bandicoot-style vibes. Then there's this, which is well known but mostly for being rare. There were only ever 125 genuine copies of Pepsi Invaders on the Atari 2600. It's a hack of the Space Invaders game for the machine, except somehow lazier. The aliens no longer move down all the way, so the game is really easy, and in any case you have infinite lives. The clue as to why all of this is the Coke on the status display there. This was commissioned from Atari by the Coca-Cola company, purely to give out to employees at a conference. 125 were made, 125 were given out, and I'm sure at least 20 of them were in the bin before anyone ever left the venue. Which would have been a mistake. The game goes for absurd money in good condition, like £2,000 absurd, and that was before pandemic inflation. In any case, you will never own it, although thankfully someone sufficiently technical got one and dumped it for us. The reason the game is impossible to lose becomes obvious at the end of 3 minutes when your score is replaced by the word wins for a subtle subliminal message. Which brings us on to the third thing, Pac-Man on the Spectrum. No really, run with me here. Because by 1988 Arcade Pac-Man was 8 years old, and the Spectrum had received official ports of Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man, and even this credible attempt at Pac-Mania. That, plus about 11 billion homebrew versions. If there's one thing the Spectrum didn't need, it was another Pac-Man game. It's strange that people remember the games released only in Japan and only in a conference centre somewhere in America with Pepsi branding on. Because in 1988, not only was there a third Pepsi-based game, authorised by Pepsi, published by US Gold, and released in the UK, it was a big rip-off of Pac-Man. And yet no bugger knows it. Ladies, gentlemen, and everything in between, I give you the Pepsi Challenge Mad Mix game. That music. It goes on and on forever. It is supposed to be Beethoven's Fifth, but it resembles it only in the way I resemble a normal functioning human being. Once you know that's what's being aimed at, you can just about credit the effort if not the overall achievement. A title screen without a title is also an innovative approach. Something else is noticeable for its absence too. Despite this being the Pepsi Challenge Mad Mix game, there isn't the sight of a Pepsi logo anywhere. In fact, despite being all over the packaging, there is not a single mention of Pepsi in the entire software product. And that's because this wasn't designed as a Pepsi game. Much like Pushover became a Quavers game late in production, this game was merely licensed and stuck in a new box to use for Pepsi's purposes in the UK. As far as I can gather, the only change was to the main sprite in order to make it slightly less likely Atari would sue Pepsi and US Gold, who presumably had a lot more money than the original publisher, Toposoft. The Topo logo, you'll note, remains in the game, and there is no US Gold branding at all either. The manual goes for the fairly gigantic stretch of calling the new lead character Pepsi Man. So far, so lazy. And also, so far, so Pac-Man. You run around, you eat all the pills, you collect power pills, or in this case tiles, in order to murder the ghosts. Re-murder the ghosts? And then you move on to the next level and do it all over again. There are mitigating factors here though. Your forms as a ghost destroyer change. My favourite being this gigantic hippo you can use to mow them down, albeit with the downside that you can't collect pills while you're in this form. In fact, all the animation is pretty bloody good for the humble Spectrum, helped by the entirely monochromatic nature of the maze, despite the adverts describing it as a colourful extravaganza. There's a couple of enemies too. The Lady Bother, who replaces already eaten pills, and the Repugnant, who glues down pills so only the Pepsi Digger power-up can retrieve them. Only the Hippo, rather than regular annoyed Pepsi Man, can kill these two, so ultimately you're going to need to learn the levels to figure out a way through. There's also some one-way doors that switch behind you, allowing for ghost escape, and a runway that turns this into the world's least interesting shooting game. That excellent animation and large sprite gameplay though has a downside. The levels scroll rather than fit on a single screen, and I've always found this death in a Pac-Man game. Without the ability to see all the ghosts, it becomes sheer luck if you don't get surprised by them at the wrong time. And when you've got one pill left on the level to eat, you might have to travel the entire bloody thing to figure out where it is. It also has the downside that this version is not immune to slowdown. and it's not exactly the quickest game in the first place. Pac-Man Championship Edition this certainly is not. The other downside in those versions of the original Pac-Man which scroll, like this Game Gear version, is that the ghosts have very specific AI that behave in very specific ways, and if you can't see them, you can't see what they're doing. That, at least, is not a problem here. As far as I can tell, all the ghosts have the same AI, and, to use a technical term, they're dumber than a bag of washing machines. Mad Mink's game is not uninteresting, but 4 years on from 2 official Atari versions of Pac-Man on the system, which managed to put their mazes on screen without scrolling, you wonder why it needed to exist. And to be fair, it wasn't going to exist in the UK until Pepsi stepped in. So this really exists as a high score game for a competition where you could win US Gold and Pepsi related prizes. Which presumably means, 3rd place, every game tier text made, 2nd place, nothing, 1st place, all US Gold's other games. And some Pepsi. But if that's the case, then it's fairly cheeky selling this game for a then pretty much full price £8. Or if you wanted a disc, 12 quid. Is this a game or is this an advert? Where did that Pepsi money actually go? Why didn't they bother putting in the barest effort to put a Pepsi logo, or the name of the game, on the title screen? Why, if you're changing the main character anyway, don't you make it a little bit more obviously Pepsi Man? I really don't quite get what was going on with this whole project. It seems half-arsed. Even the adverts at the time of the game's release tell you to stay tuned for news on the competition. They didn't even get that finished in time for a game they did crap all work on. In 2021 it almost has more of a place. We're not asking you to spend money on the thing after all. But equally, despite a couple of good ideas, it's not even a good version of Pac-Man really. And by this point you can play an arcade-perfect version of that on the residual computing pad contained within the air molecules you're breathing. So maybe after all there's a reason this game is forgotten. It's because it's so forgettable. So I suggest that's what we do and just have another game of Pepsi Man. Pepsi Man! Tricky thing picking a year for your future set game, isn't it? The Spectrum didn't actually have many of them. There's a 2003, a text adventure from DK-Tronics. There's a 2011, which appears to be some sort of school project that somehow appeared on Spectrum Computing. And there's a 2112 by the excellently named Design. So when Zeppelin Games picked 2088 for their new shooter, having waited most of the year for someone else to use the 100 years later trope, they probably felt pretty safe. No one was ever going to pick the same random year for a Spectrum game, and certainly not for another shooting-based game. You know where this is going. This is Ace 2088 from the very next year. Thankfully, that isn't this month's gaming hell, not least because I've never played Ace 1 to 2087. As we read Crash 58, it's still 1988, so 2088 doesn't yet have to contend with anyone trying to steal its name. What it does have to contend with is the fact it's the lowest scorer in the issue, earning itself a princely 40%. It's worse than that though. Crash marked as an average of multiple reviewers. Normally this was basically a gimmick. Take our old friend Super Test for instance. The score of 91% that got was made up of a 92, a 91 and an 89. Just put 9 out of 10 and have done with it, chaps. This though had 2 reviewers, awarding a 64 and a 22. Which should actually average 43, but let's not split review hairs here. Why so different? Join me, why don't you? So it's a single screen shooter, but it's got the immediate gimmick we're not shooting everything, because what we're actually doing here is supervising an evacuation. The idea is to get a bunch of those green dudes to the ship. Once enough are there, level ends, everyone happy. Which is interesting, because if the level ends up when you've got 8 of them, are we just leaving all the others behind? There must be others, because when they get blown up by the enemies, or, on a bad day, new ones arrive to take their place. Is this rescuing by quota? Save that bloke, mate? Nah, I'm clocking off for the day, we're only paid for 8. Finish a level and you get this bonus vertical scroller, and Crash says there's a bigger bonus for reaching the end. I say Crash says because I am buggered if I can do it. It's a nice distraction, although you quickly get tired of the surprisingly lengthy animation that leads up to it. And that's it, that's the game. It's classic Robotron, Geometry Wars, Super Stardust, or I made a game with zombies in it, depending on your age and console choices. But that's great, we can judge it quite happily on those merits. We're into the golden age of spec here, and some people were starting to pull off some rather impressive things. Take a moment to look just how much is going on in these levels. There's no snakes, for instance, where if you shoot the head they contract, but if you shoot the body you get multiple snakes, all of whom fly around independently. You've got multiple other types of enemy too, each with their own behaviour. There's these enemy turret things on the side that look like they've escaped directly from rebelling against a game of Breakout. They fire into the arena but can't be killed, and in another twist, if their shots collide, they create these bricks which get in your way. And they do look awfully like the bricks from Breakout, don't they? Is this the dystopian future of the Breakout universe? Do the bricks and bats eventually rise up against their human oppressors? Never mind, the blocks are benign but serve to get in your way right when you won't need it. What you also won't need is the enemy that spawns towards the end of the level if you haven't done enough snake murder. This homing bastard who moves quickly directly towards you to make your acquaintance in the form of blowing you up. A game like this lives and dies on how it moves and controls, and this thing flies. Yeah, the graphics are relatively simple, but they're certainly good enough, and there's a lot of them. The Spectrum is throwing a huge amount around the screen at times, and there's no hint of even this basic 48K version slowing down as far as I can tell. It's not paying the price in responsiveness either. I found the keyboard controls a little awkward. This is not a game for Q, W, O and P, but once I plugged in an Xbox 360 controller and used the analog stick, the thing was a revelation, and I was leaping about the screen like I needed to save a lot of little green guys quick enough to still have time to make a trip to the analogy store before it closed. Not being able to fire diagonally does mean you have to do a bit of lining up in the heat of battle, but that's the extent of the issues. The 360 controller is a good shout, because weirdly this feels like a game 20 years newer. Release a version with diagonal controls and a minor graphical overhaul and this could well have been an indie darling on the Xbox Indie Game Store circa 2008. Hell, look at classic Geometry Wars, it barely needs the graphics. There's something else we need to note here. This game is a new original game on the Spectrum at this point, and it costs £1.99. That changes a lot. It's a fifth of the price of Daley Thompson's Olympic Challenge, and as much as I like my athletics games, it's difficult to argue even this relatively simple shooter is more repetitive than a joystick breaker. I'm going to guess that for most people a full price game was more of a monthly thing, but you might be able to pick up a $1.99 most weeks. Especially if you cunningly tread that fine line of noise making in the supermarket between too well behaved and so annoying you were sent straight to bed when you got home. That sweet spot known as, I'll buy you a budget game if you shut the hell up. And on that basis, there is absolutely a week of score attack fun here in your autumn 1988 half-term holiday, especially with that 2-player option. The second reviewer basically just criticises it for looking old, and in static shots, I agree. In motion though, it's really not everyone who was doing this much on a screen this early on in the Spectrum's life, and most of them were charging full price for it. In 2021, the argument is even better. If you're an emulator player, get yourself a copy of Clive and a 360 controller, and you'd swear blind this was one of those new indie games people fall over themselves to play when they appear on itch. In 1988 and 2021, this will probably be a fleeting love, but for £1.99 then, and as an afternoon distraction now, this is a miscarriage of justice on Crash's part, and I absolutely suggest you grab a decent controller and rescue it from obscurity. On the back page today, might I recommend Weekend Lollygagger and specifically last year's Fake Olympics, held within Daley Thompson's decathlon. With foreign fans banned from this year, if it even happens at all, indulge in the safest of Olympics, featuring your favourite low-grade internet video makers including Nicky and Bunty, Renesis, Watto Snorkers, Bloggo, and more, while commented by internet legend and supplier of this part of the script, Rose Tinted Spectrum. It's 27 minutes and 8 seconds of pure sunshine. But while you're there, enjoy Lolly's lovely brand of interesting angles on gaming and important product review consumer information. It's a good time, every time. Well, except the Grange Hill video, but that's mostly the game's fault. Join us next month, where we'll discover if I've got my act together sufficiently to celebrate the holy month of Comador. Clicking subscribe and the bell will ensure YouTube lets you know. Either way, I'll be here, and with a bit of luck, so shall you be. Good night, Seattle!